good evening, this is Hound Dog Steve wishing you a very pleasant evening, and it's great to see you back again. I hope you had a great weekend. I certainly did, and the weather certainly in my location was picture perfect, fall day, autumn colours, leaves, wonderful. Okay, so I'm basically going to read a piece today by a guy called Michael Snyder from the End of the American Dream blog, and it talks about civil unrest, and civil unrest coming to America in particular. And of course we're seeing civil unrest one way or another erupting all over the world, and of course that letter goes through all of these places, although it doesn't mention the Yellow Vest protests in France, and they are still going strong, and these are all indications that there is something very, very wrong at the heart of our society and at the heart of the governing model that we have right now. It just isn't working for more and more people, and I think certainly with the spread of the internet, people are starting to get a bit of a picture that there is a real scamola taking place here, and they're on the downside. And of course, as per usual, it all comes back to the money game, whether you have enough money or whether you don't have enough money. So as you can see by this chart, inflation started seriously in 1972, and it is still on its hockey stick like upward climb. Okay, and as long as that is the case, there's going to be less and less spending power in your pocket. And if you cast your mind back, you know, I remember as a child, my mother never worked. My father's wage was enough to sustain us, and that was the same story for just about every family that I certainly was in contact with. And then all of a sudden, people had to start getting those part-time jobs. Mom started working, then it goes to full-time, and then we have the introduction of easy credit and then revolving credit. So we've reached a point where everybody has done everything they possibly can to stave off the effects of inflation. Interest rates are incredibly low, so savings are in the toilet, and now there's talk of us going to negative interest rates. So you'll be better off keeping the money under the mattress rather than in the bank, because you're going to pay the bank to keep your money in the bank. And of course there is a consequence too to people having direct deposit and direct debits. You're tied to your bank account, so there will be a charge of whatever that negative interest rate is. And so, as I say, we've reached this point where there's nowhere for people to turn, and we've got into reverse mortgages. 10 years ago, check cashing places came into Canada big time. There was a real upsurge, so people were using these places 21% on every $100 over 2 weeks. That's 500% interest in a year. So now, because there is no more wiggle room, people are going to have to face the full effect of inflation. And of course we're having food inflation, 18% this year alone. 18% increase in food costs this year alone. And of course we have politicians who are making the most outrageous promises, and of course they're doing absolutely nothing. Brexit is a good example. People are getting frustrated, populations are polarized, and it's just a matter of time before this anger rolls out onto the street, and we start attacking anything and everything that looks like it's the cause of our problems. It's not going to be pretty, ladies and gentlemen. It is not going to be pretty. Anyway, let's pop over to this letter, and I'll come back and do a very quick wrap up, because otherwise this will be just too long of a video. Okie dokie, here we go. And this from Zero Hedge. Civil unrest is erupting all over the world, but just wait until America joins the party. And this is authored by Michael Snyder via the End of the American Dream blog. All over the globe the mood is turning sour. Anger and frustration are bubbling over, and protests are becoming violent in major cities all across the planet. In some cases, economic pain is driving the protests, and in other cases, political matters are motivating the protesters. And it has been a very long time since we have seen so many angry protests happening all over the world simultaneously. Unfortunately, many believe that what we have seen so far is just the beginning. Global economic conditions are rapidly deteriorating, and as economic pain intensifies, that is only going to make everyone more frustrated. And here in the United States, the drama surrounding the potential impeachment of Donald Trump is going to greatly escalate the political tensions that are already deeply dividing this country. No matter how things turn out, a large percentage of the population is likely to be deeply frustrated with the result, and that could very easily lead to tremendous civil unrest. And this is becoming a common picture all around the world. But before we get to Trump, let's take a look at what's been going on around the rest of the world first. In Chile, we are witnessing violent protests unlike anything that we have seen in decades. 3 people died in a fire in a supermarket being ransacked in the Chilean capital early Sunday, as protests sparked by anger over social and economic conditions rocked one of Latin America's most stable countries. San Diego's mayor, Carla Rubilar, told reporters 2 people burned to death in the blaze and another later died in hospital after the huge store controlled by the US retail chain Walmart was looted. Economic conditions are tough in Chile and rapidly getting tougher, and it is very unusual to hear of looting in a country that is normally so stable. Meanwhile, political corruption appears to be the main motivation for the violent protests in Lebanon. Thousands of demonstrators poured into downtown Beirut for a 3rd day on Saturday, hours after overnight clashes erupted between security forces and protesters, leading to large-scale arrests and several injuries. Demonstrations have engulfed various parts of Lebanon for 3 days. Many protesters called for the resignation of the government and demanded the downfall of a political class that has ruled the country since the start of its 15-year civil war in 1975. When people lose hope that things are ever going to get any better, they tend to take to the streets. And as Gerald Celente said, when people have lost everything and they've got nothing else to lose, people lose it. Unfortunately, corruption appears to be a way of life over in Lebanon at this point, and there seems to be little hope of major reforms anytime soon. In the UK, the drama surrounding the Brexit saga drew hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of London this weekend. Hundreds of thousands of people have marched in central London to demand a new referendum on whether Britain should remain in the European Union, as Parliament voted to delay a decision on whether to back Prime Minister Boris Johnson's revised Brexit withdrawal deal. The march, organised by the People's Vote campaign, is thought to be the largest yet, drawing anti-Brexit supporters from across the country as Parliament sat on a Saturday for the first time since the Falklands conflict in the 1980s. Yet another Brexit agreement appears to have failed, and many are wondering if it will ever be possible to get one through Parliament. Many of those favouring Brexit are hoping for a no-deal exit from the European Union at this point, and meanwhile many of the Remainers are holding out hope that there will somehow be a second referendum. Over in Spain, violent protests have erupted night after night in the aftermath of the arrest of 9 key pro-independence leaders in Catalonia. Barcelona saw its 5th consecutive night of violence on Friday in the wake of Monday's Supreme Court ruling that jailed 9 pro-independence leaders for their role in the 2017 secessionist drive. The disturbances last night were particularly virulent in terms of the duration, intensity and use of violence on the part of protesters who were very aggressive towards the police. Violent groups surrounded the central headquarters of the National Police in the Catalan capital, throwing objects, putting up barricades and setting fire to trash containers. As the sun set, the protests moved to the centre of the city, where the regional police force, the Mossos d'Esquadra, used an armoured vehicle with a water cannon. At least 3 police officers were injured in the rioting. These protests may fade after a while, but they are not going away. Those involved in pro-independence movement in Catalonia are very passionate, and it has widespread public support. Of course, the protests that have made the biggest splash on the global stage have been the relentless pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. Despite the brutality of the police, the protesters just keep coming back again and again, and tens of thousands of protesters were in the street once again on Sunday. Tens of thousands of pro-democracy protesters took to Hong Kong streets on Sunday, once again defying a police ban on the assembly and undeterred by a brutal attack against the leader of the organisation that called for the march. The huge turnout, which included families, children and the elderly, demonstrated how the movement, now in its 5th month, continues to have widespread support despite the increasingly violent tactics used by protesters and escalating use of force by police. And of course, let's not forget the Yellow Vest protests in France right now. They have been going on. I think they're in week 48 now. Here in the United States, we don't have protests like this going on right now, but we could very soon. The impeachment process is bringing a focal point to the deep anger that has been building on both sides of the political spectrum for many years. Now that this process has begun, there is no going back, and both sides believe that there is only one result that will bring justice. For the left, any result that does remove Donald Trump from office will be a bitter disappointment. The Democrats in the House of Representatives are going to draft articles of impeachment, and they believe they already have the votes they need to send those articles of impeachment to the US Senate. If a Republican-controlled Senate does not vote to convict Trump and remove him from office, this will greatly upset the left and could result in an explosion of anger in our city streets. On the other hand, if the Republican-controlled Senate does vote to convict Trump and remove him from office, tens of millions of hardcore Trump supporters are going to be absolutely livid. There would be an explosion of righteous anger on the right, and it would almost certainly spill into our city streets. Of course, it is likely that both sides will start protesting well before there is a final result, but once the final vote in the Senate happens, that is when things are likely to get very interesting. The Democrats should have never gone down this road, because one way or another, this process is going to tear us apart. If our founders could see us today, they would be rolling over in their graves, because this is not what they intended. So it's a hang on to your hats time, I think, ladies and gentlemen. And certainly if you have direct deposit from your work, what I would suggest to you is that even if you have direct debits coming out of your account, and I would switch to paying by check, I would cancel those direct debits so they can't go directly into your bank account, pay them by check, but cash your paycheck out of the bank as soon as it's deposited. Do not let it sit in there. You need to take that out in cash, and you need to hang on to it, because if anything goes wrong, you have no control over your income anymore, and you will not be able to buy food. Okay, if there's any hiccup, the banks will shut down. All of those electronic accounts will shut down, and you will have no access to them. And if you think for a second what it'd be like for a week without food, that's not a long time, because you couldn't purchase food and you didn't have any cash in hand. So I would start cashing out your paycheck and at least keeping some of it at home in the back of a drawer or something for emergencies. Okay, well, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe below. And in the meantime, this is Hound Dog Steve signing off, wishing you a very pleasant evening, and we will talk very, very shortly. See you now. Take care. Bye.